One man made 5 decisions that changed the course of world history. Some were calculated, others catastrophic. This is the story of how Adolf Hitler's most critical war plans shaped and ultimately doomed his empire. Europe in the late 1930s stood on unstable ground. The scars of the First World War were still fresh. Economies were fragile, and political tensions were at a breaking point. Across the continent, nations watched nervously as a new aggressive power rose in Germany. With each move, from rearming the nation to annexing neighboring territories, Hitler tested the resolve of his rivals. He saw their hesitation and inaction not as a call for diplomacy, but as a green light for his ambitions. These were not random acts of aggression. They were deliberate, calculated steps on a path toward total dominance, each one building on the last, pushing Europe ever closer to the abyss of another great war. The first major test came in March of 1936. The Treaty of Versailles, signed after World War I, had created a demilitarized zone in the Rhineland, a buffer region between Germany and France. It was a cornerstone of European security, forbidding any German military presence. Hitler decided to shatter it. He ordered his troops to march into the Rhineland, a move that directly defied the treaty. It was an enormous gamble. Internally, his own generals were terrified, believing the French army would immediately intervene and crush their still rebuilding forces. They even carried secret orders to retreat at the first sign of French resistance. But France, plagued by political division and unwilling to act without British support, did nothing. The world watched, and Hitler learned a pivotal lesson. Boldness works. He saw that his opponents were paralyzed by their fear of another war, and he could exploit that fear to his advantage. The Rhineland gamble paid off, not just in territory, but in political capital. It solidified his power at home and taught him that he could break international laws with impunity. This single unopposed act of defiance set a dangerous precedent, paving the way for the aggressions that would soon follow. With his western flank secured and his confidence soaring, Hitler turned his attention to a new, revolutionary form of warfare. Traditional military doctrine relied on slow, grinding battles of attrition, reminiscent of the trench warfare of World War I. Hitler and his generals envisioned something radically different: Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. This wasn't just a new tactic. It was a complete philosophy of combat. The strategy fused the speed and power of panzer tank divisions with the terrifying precision of the Luftwaffe's dive bombers. Coordinated by radio, these forces would not engage in a head-on clash with the enemy army. Instead, they would punch through a weak point in the defensive line, bypass strongholds, and drive deep into the enemy's rear, sowing chaos and confusion. Their goal was to encircle and annihilate entire armies before they even knew what was happening. This radical approach was unleashed on Poland in September 1939. The world watched in shock as the country fell in just a few weeks. The following year, the same strategy was turned against France. The supposedly impenetrable Maginot Line was simply bypassed, and France, a major world power, was defeated in a stunning 6 weeks. Blitzkrieg seemed invincible, a terrifyingly efficient engine of conquest that rewrote the rules of modern warfare. By the summer of 1941, Hitler stood as the master of continental Europe. Only Britain remained defiant, isolated across the English Channel. At this peak of his power, he made what would become his most fateful decision: Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Driven by ideology and a belief in his own military genius, Hitler was convinced the Soviet regime was a colossus with feet of clay that would crumble under a single decisive blow. He launched the largest land invasion in history, throwing over 3 million soldiers, thousands of tanks, and aircraft across a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Initially, the Blitzkrieg tactics worked flawlessly. German armies advanced hundreds of miles, capturing millions of Soviet soldiers and vast territories. Victory seemed within reach by autumn, but Hitler had made a colossal miscalculation. He underestimated the sheer scale of the Soviet Union, the endlessness of its territory, and the resilience of its people. He also ignored the warnings of his generals about Russia's most formidable ally, winter. As the first snows fell, The German advance ground to a halt. Tanks and trucks became stuck in the mud and freezing snow. Supply lines subject stretched to the breaking point, and soldiers, unprepared for the brutal cold, began to suffer from frostbite and exhaustion. The quick, decisive victory he had planned devolved into a grinding, brutal war of attrition on a scale he could never have imagined. Just as his armies were freezing outside Moscow, Hitler made another disastrous strategic blunder. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. 4 days later, Hitler, in a show of solidarity with his ally, declared war on the United States. It was a decision he was not obligated to make, and one that baffled his own advisors. He fundamentally misunderstood America's industrial potential, dismissing it as a decadent and inefficient nation. This single act was catastrophic. It brought the full might of the American arsenal of democracy into the war against him. Suddenly, Germany was no longer fighting a European war. It was fighting a global one. The factories of the United States began churning out an endless stream of ships, planes, and tanks. Millions of fresh American troops began preparing to ship out to Europe. Declaring war on the U.S. opened a second major front that Germany, already bogged down in the Soviet Union, could never hope to sustain. The war was no longer a series of gambles he could win with boldness. It was a war testicule of industrial output and manpower, a war he had just guaranteed he would lose. As the tide of the war turned mechanism against him, with Allied forces closing in from both the East and the West, Hitler's strategic thinking grew increasingly rigid and detached from reality. This culminated in his final, ruinous military policy, the no-retreat order. From the frozen ruins of Stalingrad to the hedgerows of Normandy, he forbade any form of tactical withdrawal. Armies were ordered to stand and fight to the last man, to hold every inch of ground regardless of the strategic cost. Cities were declared fortresses, and divisions were sacrificed in pointless last stands. This wasn't a military strategy. It was a decision rooted in pride and a fanatical refusal to admit defeat. It stripped his experienced generals of their ability to maneuver, to trade space for time, and to preserve their forces for a more effective defense. Entire armies, like the Sixth Army at Stalingrad, were encircled and annihilated because they were forbidden to break out. This inflexible command Jesu wasted hundreds of thousands of lives and squandered Germany's dwindling military strength, hastening the final collapse of his empire. From the Rhineland to the bunker in Berlin, 5 key decisions chart the arc of Hitler's rise and fall. Each one, from the initial gamble to the final, fanatical order, reveals a leader who mistook early success for infallibility. History remembers not the brilliance of a plan, but its ultimate consequences. Every leader makes decisions, but the wise ones know when to adapt, when to listen, and when to change course. The story of these 5 choices is a timeless reminder that in the grand calculus of war and power, it is not just boldness but wisdom that truly wins. Thank you for watching. If you found this exploration of history valuable, please consider subscribing for more content.